Excellent. Thanks so much. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. For folks who don't know me, I'm Allison Kretzinger, our Director of Public Affairs, and I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Renee Newkirk, the Chief Financial Officer for DCYF. Thank you all for joining this morning.
We are here today to give a mid-session, I'll put in air quotes, webinar. It's definitely not the middle of session. We are closer to the end of session, but as of yesterday, hit major deadlines and milestones and cutoffs through the legislative session, as well as over the last weeks, we saw the proposed budget releases. So we tend to time this webinar to provide updates post-budget releases from both chambers, as well as have hit key deadlines and milestones when it comes to legislation that is moving. So although the title is mid, we are well past the midway point. I think it's day 86, perhaps 87. And session concludes here at the end of April. So we're definitely closer to the end than the middle, but for lack of a better term, that's the term we use. So thanks for joining. We're going to walk through what's happening for DCYF in the legislative session this year. We're going to walk through bills and budget items. We'll share overview of the process and then what bills are moving that impact the agency, our clients, our services, as well as proposed operating budgets and a little bit of capital from the House and Senate, and where things are landing and have landed in those proposed budgets for the department. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. For folks who have joined us before, this is a very familiar slide that we use frequently. For new folks, this is really just intended to chart the map of the three entities that are the state agencies, the governor's office, and the legislature that engage in this process formally. We are very much square in the green. The ball is in the legislature's court, if you will. They are making choices and decisions about investments, about laws, about policy updates here winding down quickly in the next 20 days or so, less than 20 days. And then we'll kick back over to the governor's office and the Office of Financial Management for final review, final signatures, and then to agencies to start the implementation process, as well as begin the process for next session, because we are always moving here. Things are always in flight, but just tries to lay out sort of where we're at in the process and the timelines. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about the realities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the format of how we're going to move through the day as well. But as folks are aware, this is a biennial session. It is a long session. That means they are contemplating more bills, more policy, and focusing in on setting the operating budget and capital and transportation for the next biennium, which begins July 1 and really sets the roadmap for state investments over the next two fiscal years, so fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25. That's, I think, the bulk of the work that's going to be happening over the next couple of weeks is to bring those two proposed budgets into one operating budget that will be passed along. So that means there's a lot more in play. There's a lot more on the table for consideration than in the supplemental years or the short sessions. I think another reality that guides our work at DCYF as we head into and think about this legislative session is that we are still implementing a lot of things from the last couple of years. DCYF has been very fortunate to be the recipient of fantastic policy change, significant investment across our agency, and we are very much in the throes of implementation of many of those key initiatives still. Some have ramped up and are winding down, like child care stabilization grants from the feds and other pieces, and some are very much in the ramp-up phase, like the implementation of our Community Transitions Bill or the Keeping Families Together Act, right? Those things go live this coming summer and fall, and so we're very much in the ramping up and implementing phase. So again, I think it just speaks tremendously. I think it speaks to the tremendous amount of work our teams have done in partnership with many of you on the call, our providers, and the trust the legislature has in us to continue to evolve as an agency and master investment or get investments out the door. We also know that COVID, one day this will not be on our reality slide, but it still is because it's still a reality. We know that the impacts of COVID are real. They're real for our staff, they're real for our clients, they're real for our providers, and it means that we're still reeling with what that looks like. How do we learn, right, from the impacts? What does it mean for implementation of new things? What does it mean for resource, et cetera? So it's still a real reality for all of us. And I'll let Renee talk a little bit about the economic realities.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. So the most recent revenue forecast, the March revenue forecast, has been released. it shows an increase of $194 million for the current biennium, which the current biennium ends in less than 3 months. It ends June 30th of 2023, but we are now starting to see a decrease in revenue. The forecast shows a revenue decrease of $483 million for next biennium, which next biennium are the investments that Allison and I will walk through that's included in both the Senate and House proposed budgets. And considering this decrease, we were anticipating us to not be quite as successful as we were this session. So as an agency overall, we're very, very pleased and happy with essentially both proposed budgets, the House and the Senate, considering the revenue picture. I think it's also important to note that the Washington State Supreme Court upheld the capital gains tax. This is important because the capital gains tax is an assumed revenue source for much of our early learning, specifically the early childhood education program. So I'm very happy that that is a sustained program now with capital gains tax being upheld.
Okay, excellent. So just a little bit about the format of how this is going to work. You have access to a question and answer box on your end. Please type questions as we go. Renee and I are going to walk through bills and budget items chunked into 4 categories. We're going to sort of focus on child prevention and child welfare first, through bills and proposed budget investments. We'll then talk through the program support elements, then early learning, and then juvenile rehabilitation with capital at the end. As we're going, we will pause between each of those to sort of field the questions related to that content area in the Q&A, so feel free to use that Q&A. Please use that Q&A. We'll try to answer most of those questions live if we know the answer. If we don't know the answer, we'll hold the question and follow up as we post the webinar and other things online. I'll go over the bills in some of the areas, and then Renee will go over some of the investments, and we'll sort of tag team through. It's a lot of information. We'll work on talking slow. That's less of a challenge for Renee than for myself. I say it out loud for the reminder, and we'll get through it together. So, but again, feel free to type in questions as we go, so we can address them. There'll also be time at the end if there's additional questions that we haven't gotten to. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide, and we'll kick off with some of the bills that are moving through the legislature related to the child welfare. The child welfare space. Sorry, we have the questions on the screen, so we're reading them as they come up. So these 3 pieces of legislation may be familiar or likely familiar to many of you. They are agency request legislation, meaning these are 3 pieces of legislation we put forward and went through the governor's approval process as well as and then were included in the governor's budget and ran, quote unquote, as agency request legislation. Pleased to report that all 3 are moving along as anticipated. We've had strong support from stakeholders, so thank you to those of you on the phone who've helped craft and weigh in and carry the water across the street on these pieces of legislation. All 3 are moving, and all 3 were funded in the appropriate budget. So as bills move through the process, the bill is funded in the budget in the chamber in which it's moving through. So our Family Connections bill, for example, is a House bill that is moving. And so it was funded in the House budget. It has also met all the corresponding deadlines in the opposite chamber to date. So optimistic that, again, all 3 of these will move. But our Family Connections bill will expand access to the Family Connections program across the state. The Housing Supports and Housing Access and Supports bill expands what was a pilot a number of years ago that provides ongoing case management and housing resources for families who are reunifying. This piece of legislation will expand that to provide housing options as a preventative measure to prevent removal and keep families together, as well as provide that ongoing case management by a community-based partner, which allows access to the federal dollars, the federal housing voucher. So this is really important. It allows the dependency to be dismissed, but the case management to exist, which is necessary to maximize those federal housing vouchers. The housing one is a little confusing. We had a piece of agency request legislation related to the bill. We also had a decision package that sort of went above and beyond for youth housing vouchers as well as JR. So we'll talk about this in 2 places. Pleased to note, all is moving, all is well. And then the Guardianship Assistance Program expands guardianship assistance to families who are not previously 4E eligible, and for a few other populations. So excited to see all three of these bills moving and funded in the respective budgets. Go to the next slide. These are some other child welfare related pieces of legislation that are mostly still moving, although there were some changes as of last night that I'll note as we move through. I won't talk about all of them in great detail, but give you sort of an overview of what's coming. I'll highlight 1188. This is a bill that ends, frankly, the policy that did not allow children who were in dependency to be served by Developmental Disabilities Administration and receive DDA services. And so pleased to see this bill moving. It ends that and directs the Department of DSHS, the Department of Social and Health Services, to make clear that dependent children are eligible for existing waiver services. So we'll be amending those waivers and potentially creating new waivers specific for dependent children. So thrilled to see this conversation moving and this bill moving forward. In addition, we have a couple of, I'll highlight 5683. This clarifies, a couple of years ago, we passed legislation that created a child-specific license. So a license for a young child in out-of-home care specific to a relative or kin or suitable person who would take care of that child while out-of-home care was necessary. It did not explicitly authorize that type of license for tribal children and Indian children. This will do that. So we'll be authorized to issue that for Indian children in the care and custody of us and or tribes. So we're excited to see that adjustment made. I will note that 1405 unfortunately did not make it out of the fiscal committee last night before the cutoff that was necessary. Optimistic that we may see some of this work evolve into a proviso to continue the work moving forward. But just generally, here's a snapshot of the bills we're tracking in this space. And we can go to the next slide, and Renee will talk through some of the investments in the child welfare space.
Yes, thank you, Allison. So we'll begin with prevention. So the investments you see on this slide here pertain to preventing either entering the child welfare system or preventing foster care placements. The first one, you'll see the House provides investment for SUD prevention. This program will help reduce placements into foster care. Investments in SUD, as I noted, will reduce placements, and parental substance abuse is a contributing factor of child placements, specifically contributing to 71% of infant removals across the state. So therefore, pleased to see investment here, which will connect pregnant people to services before birth, as well as connecting services for substance-exposed infants and families for services. Home visiting funding increase is provided in both the Senate and House budgets. Both the Senate and the House take a slightly but similar approach in that they both fund an approximately 20% rate increase. The mix of state and federal is slightly different in the Senate and House. The McVee federal grant has increased per the federal omnibus bill, and so that's where the Senate and the House take a slightly different approach here, but similar in that it's a 20% rate increase. The House funds additional slots for home visiting of a little over 100 slots. And also we see in both the Senate and the House investments to continue a prevention pilot program in Pierce County, specifically to prevent child abuse and neglect. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Diving further into child welfare. Both the Senate and the House fully fund DS compliance. Investments are made here to meet the obligations of the settlement agreement by implementing specific reforms to eliminate the use of hotel stays and night-to-night placements. Some of those specific reforms include the Emerging Adulthood Program. This provides funding for housing and case management and supports youth preparing for independent living. Also provides funding for professional therapeutic foster care for the department to develop and implement the professional therapeutic foster care contract and licensing category. Also provides funding for a statewide hub home model to further develop, adopt, and expand the existing hub home model. Funding for referrals and transitions to develop and implement a new referrals and transitions protocols. Funding for qualified residential treatment program to conduct assessments for children and youth prior to the placement in a QRTP and ongoing assessments every 90 days for the duration of the placement. So really good, significant investment here to help address the DS settlement agreement. Also funded in both the House and the Senate is combined in-home services. These are services provided to help reunify families, to stabilize the family, as well as prevent children from entering into foster care. So what was funded in both the House and the Senate are additional capacity building grants. I should not say additional, capacity building grants to help grow providers and providers' ability to provide additional services, and therefore also provides funding for additional services to be provided. So capacity building as well as service delivery funding. The House and the Senate both provide funding for YV LifeSet. The Senate provides funding to maintain our existing YV LifeSet programs in King County and the Yakima Tri-Cities area, whereas the House provides funding to maintain the current YV LifeSet programs. Right. Family time, this is our supervised visitation contracts. What was funded in both the House and the Senate, fully funded, is what we refer to as separate billables. These are individual pay points, which include items such as visit reports that are provided to the caseworker as well as the court, unusual incident reports, no-show fee, cancellation fee, no-show report, cancellation report, etc. This funding is effective actually May 1st, so that's important to note. So the department will be reimbursing for all these separate billable pay points effective May 1st. That is less than a month away. The Senate and the House provide investment in the Kinship Caregiver Engagement Unit. This is a unit that helps kinship families navigate through the licensing process. This began as a pilot, has been expanding, and this funding provides the additional funding that we need for the remaining 7 FTE to bring this unit statewide. Initial license maintenance payment per House Bill 1227 going into effect July 1st of 2023 is an initial license in which it allows the department to issue foster care maintenance payments up to 90 days for those kinship caregivers who obtain an initial license. And with that, the department will need additional licensing staff to support that effort. So the Senate provides an additional 10 FTEs, whereas the House provides an additional 20 FTEs. Housing access and supports. Both the Senate and the House provide funding for housing supports for youth that are exiting foster care. These supports include locating housing, working with landlords, helping youth complete an application for housing, and with this support then leverages and provides the ability for youth to access the federal housing vouchers, as Allison spoke about earlier. So really excited to see this investment. Caregiver placement supports funded in both the Senate and the House. There's actually 2 components to this funding. The first is replacing our current 4-level foster care maintenance payment system to a 7-level system to help address caregiver supports necessary to care for children with varying needs. This was based on research provided by RDA, and this goes into effect January 1st of 2024. The second component of this, I should note too, the new 7-level system funding in the House and the Senate is consistent. They're the same. Where you see the funding difference here is in this next category, which is caregiver support for all caregivers, regardless if you're licensed, unlicensed, relative, not a relative. And really the strategy here is to ensure that all caregivers have access to the same level of support services and that all caregivers receive standard support for children with lower levels of need. And for children with higher levels of support need, what's included here is the standard support, but also in addition to that, a behavioral support. So the behavioral support are things such as real-time parenting and coaching, after-hours behavioral support. The difference in funding in relation to the Senate and the House is the Senate takes a more scaled approach to what was included in the governor's budget in terms of not assuming a ramp up and expansion of the caregiver placement supports in the out years. So additional funding is necessary, which it most likely will be. The department would be required to request that funding. Whereas in the House budget, there is an assumed ramp up through fiscal year 27. It does not include funding for case aids for those at levels 1 and 2, but provides supports for all other levels. Foster care maintenance payment increases. The House funds basic foster care maintenance rate of an additional $50 per youth, also including supervised independent living subsidy for youth in extended foster care. The House funds, yeah, it's a lot here, I know. Lots of investment. The House funds a foster youth mentoring pilot. The House and the Senate both fund children's advocacy centers at different levels. The House funds an increase for CPAs for licensing incentive payment. Rising Strong is funded in the House for a grant to the Rising Strong model, as well as one-time funding to lead a development of a sustainable operating funding model for programs. Pre-House Graduation for Success is funded in both the House and the Senate at different levels. CWIS. The Senate provides one-time funding for a feasibility study for us to complete regarding CWIS. CWIS is our Comprehensive Child Welfare Information System. This is the case management system. This is really critical because without this, we are unable to continue to make technology changes. We will no longer be able to adjust and comply with new laws and court decisions. And we're also unable to claim federal FFPSA dollars without this system. The federal government requires specific data sets in order for us to claim that federal funding, which we are currently not able to provide today, but we will be able to provide under a CWIS system. And this funding was not included in the House budget. Funding is included for an SSPS replacement system. This provides authorization and payment processing for most of our child welfare and early learning systems. CCDF audit resolution. This is more of a technical request, if you will, in which the State Auditor's Office requires us to provide child-level detail, which we're currently not able to provide today. It requires some resource and investment here, which the House funds. The Senate does not fund, but does require us to provide that child-level detail. The House and the Senate both provide funding for a culturally relevant language access program for us to implement this program and to support language access to providers and clients. I should have noted that was our program support slide. I transitioned from child welfare to program support, which is back office essentially, as well as cross-agency programs. So continuing on with program support, the House funds the Breakfast Group, mentoring youth ages 12 to 19 in South King County. Team Child is included in the House budget, a funding increase to continue providing legal services for youth, and additional, rather, that is an increase. The House provides funding for a rate increase for independent living service providers, and the House also funds a contract for 3 separate studies for future planning of $300,000. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I think I got through child welfare and support. A lot of investment. Okay.
A lot of information. Monitoring the chat, a couple questions. One, just technical. Yes, slides will be available. Community engagement will send them out. They'll also be posted on the DCYF website. There's a question about revenue. We'll save that to the end so we can get through the content, but I definitely see it there. And in theory, I can click these away as I answer them. If it says not included in X budget, what does that mean? Great question. Can we go back one slide just so I can give an example? So not included in the Senate budget means that it was not included in the proposed operating budget for the Senate, and it was included in the budget. So at this point, we have sort of proposed budgets, and some investments are in one, some investments are in the other, and some investments are in both, and sometimes that's the same, and sometimes that's different. So what we're trying to demonstrate here on the slide is a side-by-side, sort of the item or the object, and then what budget it was included in, at what level, and how. Again, some are the same and some are different. So if it says not included in the Senate budget, that item, or not included in the X budget, that item was not included in that proposed budget, and that's where you see a difference in the 2 proposed budgets. When we get to the end, I'll talk a little bit about next steps and what that all means. And these are early learning questions. Right, yep, so there's still a chance the two bodies reconcile budgets and keep something alive. Exactly, so what happens, maybe I'll just address that now before we dive into the early learning space. What happens is that both the House and the Senate introduce their proposed budgets, they pass those proposed budgets off their respective floor, and then they go into what's called conference. And over the next 2 to 3 weeks, budget negotiators and budget writers are conferencing on the budget. And by the end of April, a couple of days before session ends, a conference budget will come out that has agreement, and that'll be the final budget. So right now, there's absolutely opportunity to influence the final budget. If something is in both budgets at the same level, it's highly likely it stays. Strange things have happened, but if something is funded in both budgets at the same level or similar level, it's highly, highly likely that remains in the conference budget. Really, where they're negotiating are where you see differences. So something is in one budget and not in another, or they choose different levels of funding. We'll talk about that as we go through some of the child care stuff and the ECEAP stuff. There's a real good just examples of different options, different choices made. And those are where they're going to be having conversations to decide what's in the final budget. That happens now over the next couple of weeks, with that being ended at the end. Does it have to be in both budgets to be improved? So I think I addressed that, but just more concretely, the final budget has to be voted on by both chambers and passed by both chambers. So these budgets now have been debated and passed off their respective floors, and they're in that conference time. Budget negotiators are working on those areas of difference and bringing together one final budget that then will come out of conference. This all happens behind closed doors. These are not public hearings. There's no more public hearings on these things. And then it will go to each floor to be voted on, not likely amended at that point or amended very much, and then each chamber will vote it up, pass it, and then it will go to the governor. This will all happen towards the end of April. So right now is that moment of influence for what goes in the final budget through this conference process. Great questions. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about, I'm gonna pivot to early learning here. Related to CWIS, actually we'll pause and answer this question. You noted there are federal dollars not being drawn down. Does that a reporting limitation? What types of federal dollars are those? Approximately how much are we leaving on the table? Good question, Nicole. I'll let Renee talk a little bit about FFPSA.
Yeah, so FFPSA is under Title 4E. FFPSA provides federal funding for specific strategies, if you will, that must be included in a state plan and approved by the federal government in order for us to draw down. Those FFPSA investments really are intended for upfront services, if you will, in the child welfare system. Title 4E provides federal funding for placement services. So FFPSA, the Family Prevention Services Act, is just that, prevention. So preventing foster care placements.
Good question. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about early learning and the bills that are moving through the early learning space. I see a question around transitional kindergarten, and I will address that when we get there. There's 4 bills really that we're tracking in the early learning space that will have impacts for families and providers. 5225 is related to increasing access to working connections. It adds access to some unique and identified populations, as well as 1525, the apprenticeship bill, makes working connections eligible for those in their first year of an apprenticeship program. The background check bill, so folks will remember during the pandemic, the licensing fees and background check fees were waived. These were temporary waives. DCYF actually explored potential agency request legislation on this. The governor's budget took a different approach, continuing to waive temporarily, and then we saw this bill emerge by Senator Wilson that would maintain the permanent waiving of licensing fees and background check fees for child care providers, as well as group care providers. That bill is still moving. It is still alive, so we're thrilled to see, DCYF is excited to see that moving. That means what the experience now will remain. If this bill does not pass, effective July 1, those licensing fees would go back into place and background check fees would go back into place for child care providers. 1550 is transitional kindergarten. This has been a bill that has evolved and looks really different than its first iteration. It has moved out of the Senate Fiscal Committee. It will be a bill that goes to conference. The House and Senate have different approaches around transitional kindergarten, so it will be a bill that ends up going to conference, again, sort of that negotiation between leads in each chamber. There's a question about, after all of the investments in childcare, I'll just read the question verbatim. After all investments in childcare, why did DCYF align itself with OSPI regarding the TK bill instead of supporting providers and families? I want to be really clear. DCYF has expressed strong support for providers and families. we submitted almost $1 billion of decision packages in childcare and ECEAP investments to increase rates, increase access, increase grants, increase grant funding, add new slots. We submitted almost $1 billion between our decision packages in ECEAP and childcare, both working connections as well as the supporting families and supporting providers decision package. All those decision packages were worked on and stakeholdered this summer. They were then, the governor made choices about what was funded in the governor's budget, and you saw substantial investments continue in childcare through rates, some of the grant pieces, as well as ECEAP to meet entitlement. Separate from that, there was a policy conversation around transitional kindergarten and what that means. And I want to be really clear that DCYF is supportive of the transitional kindergarten funding stream that flows through districts, that allows districts to open and operate transitional kindergarten classrooms. DCYF has also been very clear we support quality guardrails that align with the expectations for early learning providers in the early learning community. Again, this bill will go to conference. We continue to be in the conversation around what does that quality guardrail look like? How do transitional kindergarten classrooms represent and use developmentally appropriate practice, developmentally appropriate curricula, et cetera. This will be an ongoing conversation over the next couple of weeks, but I want to be really clear that we are very supportive of continued investments in the childcare workforce, in the childcare community, and access for families. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to talk through the investments in early learning in both budgets. Like child welfare, there are a lot of them. So continue to ask questions as we go. It's really helpful to answer them in real time. This slide focuses on some of the grant investments. So childcare complex needs and equity grants were initially funded as part of the Fair Start for Kids Act. We see increased funding to both of these grants. So there's some base funding that continues, but we see increased funding in childcare complex needs in both the House and Senate. Slightly different levels, but a positive in our minds that there is funding in both budgets. We also see new funding for the tribal early learning grants. These are grants specific to tribal programs, early learning programs serving tribal children, and tribal early learning programs really focused on how do we ensure language continuity, language programming, support that is unique to our tribal partners or providers serving tribal children. And then we see investments in the equity grants. The House and Senate take a slightly different approach in funding level, but largely the intent is the same. So again, the funding level of these things will be negotiated through the compromise, but we're optimistic that we'll see increases in these and funding for these three grant options. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll talk about working connections related items. So both the House and Senate fund the 85th percentile for subsidy reimbursement. This is huge. I have been an early learning advocate for a number of years. Prior to coming to DCYF, was a strong early learning advocate doing coalition work. And I remember not very many years ago, we were at the 35th or 40th percentile for child care center reimbursement rates. To be at the 85th percentile of the newest market rate survey is tremendous investment for this state. And I am really thrilled to see this investment. It's very exciting for providers, it's exciting for families, and we know we have work to do. The cost of care work is underway, and right now, I just want to note the tremendous growth we've seen in investment in the child care space and in reimbursement rates in really just the last 4 to 5 years. Both budgets also include what was called hold harmless. So there was a 16% rate increase to working connections last year that put a few ages and regions over that 85th percentile. Those will remain and hold harmless, so no provider will see a reduction in their rates. Both the House and Senate fund the governor's proposed item that stemmed from a decision package to allow continuity for families mitigating homelessness still, so that child care subsidy will remain by removing the restriction on consecutive homeless grace periods. And then the House funds the non-standard hours rate. So DCYF did some non-standard hours rate work a couple of years ago, recommending a rate for that. The House makes that investment and funds that. It was not included in the Senate budget. So again, something that'll go to conference. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Additionally, both budgets fully fund the SEIU 925 collective bargaining agreement. So this contemplates the 85th percentile for family child care providers, as well as increases for family, friend, and neighbor providers. It waives the background check fee. So regardless of the outcome of 5316, 5631, the bill related to background checks, that fee will be waived for family child care providers and their staff per the collective bargaining agreement. It also continues the cost of care enhancement for family child care providers that was negotiated in the last round of negotiation. So the We see the CBA fully funded in both budgets. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this slide is the early learning pieces specific to ECEAP, the Early Childhood Education and Assistance Program. The House and Senate take slightly different approaches to the rate increases as well as the slot distribution. You see the Senate funds an 18% rate increase for school day and working day and a 9% rate increase for part day slots. The House funds a 17% rate increase for school day with a 3% for working day and part day slots. So again, moments for influence, folks will be weighing in on that for the final budget. Positive, there's rate increases, and they take a slightly different approach, but there are rate increases in both budgets. You also see some different approaches to slot increases or slot expansion. The Senate budget funds 1,000 slots per year, 1,000 school day slots, per year, and 100 working day slots per year in fiscal years 24 and 25, and then does some things in the out year. The House budget funds 500 in each fiscal year, school day in fiscal year 24 and 25. So that is, again, just slightly different approaches. Again, will be negotiated sort of where the slot expansion lands. The House also does conversion, so they take 1,000 of the part day slots in each school year and convert those to full day school day slots in both fiscal years 24 and 25. The House also funds increased funding for the complex needs, the ECEAP-specific complex needs. There is base funding that remains. This would be an increase to that. If it is included in the final budget, you see the House does some investment there. Both budgets fund to maintain early ECEAP slots as well as provide a 20% rate increase for early ECEAP. Before I get too far, I see a question around the 85th percentile. When would the 85th percentile rate be effective if a bill is passed? So there's no bill necessary for the 85th percentile. The Fair Start Act that passed a couple of years ago said by now the legislature would fund the rates at the 85th percentile. That is still law. And so the budget this will likely be included in the final budget. It's in both. Don't cash the check yet. But it would be effective July 1. The 85th percentile would go effective July 1. Our system in partnership with, we are prepared to implement that in partnership with DSHS from a data system perspective, but that rate increase would be effective July 1. So your July bill, essentially, so you would see those payments in August for your July care. Great question. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so some other investments in early learning that are worth noting here. We have a DCYF a couple of years ago was funded to do an organizational license pilot. So really encouraging the department to look at, are there ways to issue organizational licenses for entities that may have multiple sites but have one sort of administrative structure and umbrella? We're about 2 years into that pilot and recognize we need a little bit more time as well as need to continue do sort of the first round of launch to see how it works. This was funded via proviso, so not uncommon that we only had the funding for 2 years because it was just in the budget. There was no bill associated with this item. So we're pleased to see these resources continue so we can continue that pilot and then make recommendations around what an organizational license could look like in our state. The House also invests in the Imagination Library to the tune of $4 million for the biennium. This is the Dolly Parton book mailing program. And so you see the House investment there, more books sent to young children 0 to 5 across the state. The House also invests $2 million in an online preschool kindergarten readiness program that is intended to provide on preschool through technology-based software to families who may not have access. So you see that investment in the House budget, $2 million by idiom. The House also invests in a rate increase for our ECEAP providers, our early support for infants and toddlers. So you see an ECEAP rate increase that will be rolled out this year if it sticks. Again, in the House budget, currently not included in the Senate budget at this time. You see investment in early learning dashboards. So this is a partnership between DCYF and a nonprofit, WASTEM, who produces sort of online dashboards. So this is really to increase the usability of those and continue to ensure that there's the publicly available data related to early learning, childcare access, ECEAP access, et cetera. The House also chooses to invest in the Washington Communities for Children one-time funding to continue some of their network work. Again, you see this just in the House budget, not included in the Senate budget at this time. Go ahead and go to the next slide. A few more investments in the early learning space. You see both budgets include a proviso that really directs development of a plan for continued childcare access and really contemplating that living wage. How do we increase wages in the childcare space? So you see a proviso funded at slightly different levels, but for the department to sort of lean in and continue to lead on that planning work. This would clearly be done in partnership with Childcare Aware, who's got a design team underway in the provider space. So we're excited to see the legislature codify the importance of this continued conversation and excited to be continue to be part of that conversation. The House also includes a proviso that directs DCYF to update a rate model and propose some changes to the special needs rate, the child care special needs rate. As part of Working Connections, providers can access a child care special needs rate for children who meet certain qualifications. This is really, really underutilized, and so really the legislature is looking at us to sort of make recommendations to say, how do you increase this rate and how do you better utilize this option for families and providers? You also see the House include funding to increase contract with an entity to expand the number of childcare businesses through peer mentorship programs. You see an increase there. The Senate also includes funding for specific to a one-time contract to launch early learning organization in King County to sort of offset and mitigate access challenges in King County. Specific, this is a provider is named in this proviso, which is pretty not common, I'd say pretty unique. So we see that there. The next. Okay, so that was our sort of early learning overview. I'm continuing to pause and see if there's questions. Again, I see the capital gains questions. We'll get to them at the end, and we'll keep the questions coming if you have them. We'll keep plowing through here. We're going to pivot and talk about juvenile rehabilitation. So third part of DCYF's work here is our juvenile rehabilitation, our juvenile justice work. Two bills still in play. Again, as I noted earlier, 1405 did not pass, potentially has an option and a hope of becoming a proviso. We'll see. But two bills to highlight, creating developmentally appropriate responses to youth who commit sexual offenses. This provides some grant funding that DCYF would administer to locals to continue to support young people who have committed sexual offenses as well. The institutional ed bill, so we've been on a journey as we try to reform and do better when it comes to institutional education, so education delivered education delivered in the institutional settings. So this is sort of the next step in that, which directs by date certain, OSPI would name an entity to be in charge of delivery of institutional education. Excited to see that bill moving and have been partners in that work. And then as I noted, 1405 didn't pass. Before we go to the next slide, there are a few early learning questions coming in. I thought there was a bill for childcare staff to have automatic access. Yep, I mentioned that bill. That is 5225. That's the one that increases access for childcare providers, undocumented families, and others. So that bill is still alive and moving. Who sponsored the ask? No idea. We don't often know who the member was who requests certain items. I'm not sure who the member was who asked for that request to be included. You have a chart showing the current rate, the new 85th percentile on DCYF's website. I don't believe it is yet on the website for the new market rate survey. It will be as we get ready to launch. So as we get ready to unveil that rate, we certainly will. I don't think there's anything yet posted on the website, but certainly will be as we get closer. Great question. A couple questions about ECEAP. I am not sure. We'll do some follow-up on the technicalities of the ECEAP rate increase and how that may what that may look like. Okay, we want to go to the next slide. I'll walk through some of the investments in the juvenile rehabilitation space. So like I noted, we continue to partner in the conversation around education delivery in our institutions as part of the recommendations that came out of 1295, which was the last work group on this. There was a recognized need for increased staffing to ensure that young people have access to the classroom, that DCYF has staff to support and facilitate ongoing learning for young people. And so we have some additional FTE capacity funded in both budgets that will support just that, access to education, and we're excited to continue to see this funding and continue to be a partner in education delivery in our institutional settings. We also, as noted earlier, we talked about housing both as a bill. Renee talked about housing in the child welfare space. This is the housing support for young people who are exiting JR. So slightly different than the child welfare, as we don't often draw down federal vouchers. but contracted housing supports for young people who are exiting JR and reentering communities. This can be housing, this is case management, this is support for housing as well. Super critical as we think about implementation of CTS, our Community Transitions Program, but also is a huge need for young people who are exiting our system. And absolutely necessary to meet the intent of 5290, which passed a number of years ago to ensure we're not exiting people into homelessness. So housing is a critical strategy there. I want to highlight a proviso included in the Senate budget and kind of included in the House budget. There were a series of bills this year that contemplated legal fines and obligations, record sealing, the jurisdiction of juvenile court, et cetera. All of those bills, unfortunately, did not make it past their respective deadlines in the Senate, but the Senate sort of took the intent of those bills and created a proviso and directed the Office of Juvenile Justice here at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to do some study and report work related to those bills and make recommendations to the legislature. A sort of cascade of timelines there, but included some resource for that conversation to continue with the Partnership Council and other stakeholders and make recommendations about those three elements. The House took a slightly different approach, actually a pretty dramatically different approach. They said the Administrative Office of the Courts should study LFO's impact on juveniles and make recommendations. So similar content area, slightly different approaches. The OJJ work would live at DCYF, the AOC work would live at AOC, not at DCYF, looking at slightly different things. So we'll likely see something that emerges from this space in a final budget, unclear what that will be yet. Also included in the House budget was one-time funding to Credible Messengers to provide mentorship in Kitsap County to at-risk, high-risk young people who perpetrate violence and who reside in the areas. So again, one-time engagement. This is a named entity to Credible Messengers to support ongoing mentorship work in Kitsap County. Go to the next slide. A couple other investments that we'll name here related to JR. There's juvenile court funding specific to sort of the block grant dollars. We also see a one-time investment in therapeutic gaming rehabilitation support for folks residing at juvenile facilities in the Senate budget. And we see in the House budget funding for the Secretary of State to start up a library at Green Hill School. The Secretary of State did this at Echo Glen over the last year and are really interested in expanding their partnership. So Secretary of State funding, but at our Green Hill facility there for the library. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Renee to walk through some of the capital investments in JR and then in other buckets as well.
Thank you, Allison. So shifting from operating budget to capital investments, both the Senate and the House invest in minimum security transitional living centers. The Senate funds $8.7 million at Green Hill, whereas the House funds $9.2 at Echo Glen and $1.2 in Green Hill, the same investment essentially as the Senate, but just pushes it out to the future biennium. Echo Glen security enhancements, which are really critical, are funded in both the Senate and the House. Approaches to the Naysell Youth Camp closure, we no longer have youth at the Naysell Youth Camp, so both budgets provide funding for a warm closure of the Naysell Youth Camp to DCYF. The Senate also provides funding to OFM to convene a task force to determine and make recommendations regarding the use of the Naysell Youth Camp. Whereas in the House budget, our warm closure funding that we receive is directed to go into a contract with DSHS to have them manage the warm closure, and then also for DSHS to conduct a feasibility study regarding the use of the Naysell Youth Camp to determine if it would meet the needs of the True Blood Settlement Agreement. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. The Senate and the House provide funding not in DCYF's budget, but in Commerce's budget for Early Learning Facilities Fund expansion. Also in Commerce's budget provides funding for Rising Strong Capital West program. I noted in the House budget on the operating side, there's investments made there and just wanted to expand a little bit further on the Rising Strong model. This is a residential treatment program that keeps families together while treating the entire family. Treatment here for parents includes SED treatment, counseling, parenting skills, whereas treatment provided to children provide quality childcare, educational supports, mental health screen, and treatment. This model is currently in Spokane on the east side. We do not have the infrastructure and capital support on the west side. So this provides the capital support investment to bring this model to the west side of the state, which we would follow up with an operational request, as it's included in both the Senate and the House. So hopefully this will make it through to the enacted budget. Okay, I can go to the next slide. As we noted, investment in contracted services, the Senate and the House both fully fund the collective bargaining agreement investing in DCYF staff, providing a general salary increase, otherwise known as a cost of living increase of 4% that's effective this coming July 1st of 2023, with a 3% increase July 1st of 2024. Also provides a one-time $1,000 lump sum payment for those employees who show verification of up-to-date COVID-19 vaccination boosters. There are some other investments here pertaining to DCYF staff that I won't go into the details of, but is included in the collective bargaining agreement. Okay.
All right. That was a lot of information.
Yes.
Thanks all for hanging in there with us. A couple of questions. Again, we'll follow up on the ECEAP question later. There's a couple questions related to the capital gains funding. Oops, I'm not sure what happened to the picture there. What is the allocation for capital gains? How do we track the funding? And then can you touch base on next steps for funding now the Supreme Court upheld capital gains? Will there be opportunities to weigh in on how these funds are used with the revenue sessions, et cetera? I think the long and short of the answer, and then I'll turn it over to Renee, but the capital gains revenue is already assumed in the investments we walked through today. It doesn't create new money. I think the legislature has been anticipating that. So I'll turn it over to Renee to talk through some of the logistics there.
Yes, that's exactly right. The capital gains tax is already assumed in our budget. It's already assumed as a revenue source. So essentially it's status quo, if you will. The capital gains tax, just to further clarify, it's a 7% tax on the sale of financial assets and stocks and bonds. It does not apply to real estate. It is not a property tax. And so I don't know if that information is helpful, but that's essentially what the capital gains tax is, and it is already assumed in our budget, as Allison noted. So from here, we'll just have to watch the revenue forecast, the subsequent revenue forecast, to see if that capital gains tax is increasing or decreasing, and therefore what is the impact on our programs.
Right. Other questions before? Just would take a moment to say, are there any plans, bills to help streamline all the funding streams for IPK? I think by IPK, you mean integrated preschool. So that was a report from a couple of years ago. I think that's a great question, and I think that's a question we've got to explore together with partners and providers this interim. How do we create a mixed delivery, unified, universal system for early learning? Right now, no, there isn't a plan and there isn't a strategy. We have a variety of funding streams that fund different programs for 0 to 5-year-olds across our state. We have Working Connections, we have ECEAP, we have transitional kindergarten, we have developmental preschool dollars that layer on. We have local dollars like Seattle Preschool and other local levy dollars that provide subsidy and childcare supports. And you know, in a perfect world, I'm about to get on my soapbox here a little bit and out of step. The short answer is no. There's not anything moving currently that solves this problem. I think that the universal childcare proviso that we talked about in partnership with some of the work that Child Care Aware is doing, in partnership with, you know, some of the previous work from the integrated pre-K plan are the direction, the conversation we need to be having as a community, as an early learning community, to yield sort of what are the recommendations and what are the next steps. How do we ensure there's adequate funding for a high quality mixed delivery system that families can afford, that provides living wages to providers? That's a really simple goal statement. I think that's the shared goal across many. How we do that is really complicated and it's hard work. And we don't have a plan yet to do that. But I do think that's I would recommend that's the next phase of the conversation we have, and we figure out how to maximize and leverage all the funding streams in a mixed delivery way with a set of quality standards that we know are going to yield outcomes for kids. But that's Allison's soapbox, and I'll leave it there. But great question. Great, I appreciate you asking the question. Couple more seconds, we'll stay on to see if any other questions pop through, but I would just say we really appreciate everyone joining. You may have addressed this, but are there any areas where you are concerned you didn't get necessary funding in one or both of the budgets to implement legislation that funding is associated with? As far as specific bills, we've really done the fiscal note analysis. I will say that our fiscal notes have been pretty on point, and the funding corresponding to each of the fiscal notes was really on point. I think the biggest concerns we have from a funding perspective, not tethered to legislation, are the CWIS feasibility dollars, ensuring that we can really do the work necessary to build and implement the CWIS system, as well as the funding resources necessary to do that child-level audit work in working connections. Those are relatively minor concerns, I think, compared especially to many of our friends across state government today. But as far as our bills go, our fiscal notes are trending and tracking on par with, our funding levels are trending and tracking on par with what our fiscal notes asked for. Great question. Thanks, Lori. I appreciate it. All right. I just would take the opportunity to say thanks for joining. We got less than 20 days left. It's a slog, it's a grind, it's a marathon at a sprint pace. Please do reach out with any questions. Happy to continue to be a resource and a partner in this work. Thank you all so much for your partnership this legislative session. I would just underscore, Renee and I are humbled and pleased to sit here and give this type of report at this point in the session. We recognize that all of our partners aren't able to do the same thing, and we're really excited about that. Are ECEAP contractors considered state employees? No, ECEAP contractors are not considered state employees unless the ECEAP contractor is a state entity, which I don't actually think we have any. Those are all local employees through school districts or nonprofits or community-based organizations. And with that, just again, thanks for, is there a specific rate structure for the new caregiver support levels? When will it be released? Great question. We can follow up with that. Sarah, yes, there is a methodology there and a rate structure. We can't go into it in 2 minutes, and it's probably easier with visuals, but certainly can follow up. I think I have your email, Sarah. If not, feel free to shoot Renee or I an email, and we can follow up with that.
Yeah, I think just to add to that too, it'll be dependent on which approach is taken in the conference budget and the enacted budget. That was an area where the House and the Senate were not in alignment, entire alignment. So that's when we will just have to wait and see.
Yep, that's a good point. Thanks. Great. Ben, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for all the kind thanks. We appreciate it. And stay tuned for an end of session wrap-up webinar in late April, early May. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Yes, thank you all.